Hello, listeners. We have some exciting news for you. Ohio Governor Mike DeWine has signed Senate Bill 109 into law, a bill that will provide greater transparency for patients and help to hold providers that engage in sexual misconduct more accountable. This bill has been a long time coming, and it's the result of Governor DeWine's working group to address the medical board's handling of sexual misconduct cases and the board's collaboration with stakeholders. Among some of the changes that it will bring are changes made to the criminal code to ensure the board can take action in certain situations of licensees engaging in sexual misconduct. The time in which healthcare facilities, licensees, and professional associations must report various conduct to the board is generally shortened to 30 days. The board is also authorized to summarily suspend a licensee if the board receives verifiable information that a licensee has been charged with a felony and the conduct charge constitutes a disciplinary violation under Ohio law. And this is a big one. The board is now authorized to provide a status update regarding an investigation to a complainant on request if the board verifies the complainant's identity. These changes and so many more are coming now that the bill has been signed into law, and we could not be more thrilled for the protections it offers Ohio patients. We are grateful to Governor DeWine and the Ohio General Assembly for making this legislation possible. It's just one more way the board can help protect patients from dangerous providers. In honor of this occasion, we are re-releasing our 2 episodes that explain the board's handling of sexual misconduct cases. Please take care in listening. This episode contains discussions about provider sexual misconduct and may be inappropriate for some listeners. Please use discretion. If you have not listened to our last episode, I encourage you to go back and listen to it before you proceed with episode 4. It'll provide a lot of context and a lot of the background for how the board handles sexual misconduct complaints.
Before I talk to the other board members, I thought that this case personally elicited a quote that I've not heard in the 30 years of dealing with these kind of cases. And the quote comes from patient 1. She said, I understand fight, or she's a trained victim advocate. I understand fight or flight, but I did not understand freeze until this happened, which is the main reason why I didn't come forward sooner, because I was terrified and ashamed and pretty much disgusted with myself that I took it, that I laid there, that I didn't say anything, I didn't fight. That is one of the most compelling statements I've heard in 30 years of practice, explaining so much about sexual abuse. With that, are there members of the board that would like to speak?
What you just heard was a portion of a board meeting discussion from a case that came before the board for final decision in 2022. A case that involved a physician's sexual misconduct against multiple women in a setting where their guard was down. Ultimately, the board voted to permanently revoke this physician's license for his grossly inappropriate behavior. But stay tuned to find out how the details of this case unfolded. You're listening to Med Board Pulse, a podcast by the State Medical Board of Ohio. I'm your host, Jerica Stewart, Chief of Communications. Let's talk, Ohio. In our last episode, our Sexual Misconduct Unit Chief shed some light on the board's definition of sexual misconduct and many of the different types of behaviors that warrant discipline. Today, we're going to do something a little different. I'm going to walk you through some of the details of a case the board adjudicated in 2022 to give you an idea of how a complaint is handled and processed in real life. But first, let's set some ground rules. If you recall, complaints and the identity of the complainant are always confidential, even after a final discipline is taken. Of course, the physician's misconduct as a matter of public safety is public record and can be accessed at any time. But for our purposes, I'm going to de-identify the physician in this case. To be clear, we can only talk about facts in this case that are public record, and that means sticking to the hearing record, citations, minutes, and board order. Now let's dive in. Today we'll be discussing a physician that was licensed in Ohio. The board first issued a citation to, let's call him Dr. X, based on allegations that during an exam he inappropriately touched, failed to use proper draping or disrobing practices, acted in a sexual manner and unwanted manner, and/or made inappropriate comments to 3 patients. I'll spare you from the specific details of those exams at this time. Dr. X made the decision to request a hearing, and it was during that hearing that the board uncovered the truly heinous details of his behavior. I want to help you as listeners understand the underlying facts of this case that we're going to be discussing today. And so I'm sitting down with our Deputy Director of Enforcement, Mindy Snyder, who was actually the Assistant Attorney General representing the board on this case back in 2021 and 2022. Mindy, I'm glad that you're here. Can you please introduce yourself, just explain your role at the board as well?
Good morning, Jerica. I am so happy to be here and talk about this issue and really important case. I am the Deputy Director of Enforcement with the State Medical Board of Ohio. My role as the Deputy Director is to oversee the cases that the board is building, not only sexual misconduct cases, but other types of cases like standards cases, felony convictions. And I work with an amazing team of attorneys to do that. And we are a very dedicated group of public employees with the mission to protect the public and ensure good practice of medicine in the state of Ohio.
We've talked a lot about in the last couple of episodes how the board tries to protect the public and really what our role is there. How does your role now as the Deputy Director of Enforcement differ from that role that you were playing as an AAG or an Assistant Attorney General not that long ago at all?
Yeah, thank you. So I was a proud Assistant Attorney General for 20 years with the Ohio Attorney General's office.
That's a long time.
It's a long time, and I really loved that job a lot. In that job, I worked in the Health and Human Services section, and I represented a variety of boards and agencies in the healthcare licensing world. But the last 15 years, I was dedicated almost entirely to the State Medical Board. And as an Assistant Attorney General, my role was to litigate the cases that were built by the medical board or brought forth by the medical board. And again, those cases ranged from minimal standards of care violations to convictions, but I primarily specialized in sexual misconduct cases. Those were the cases that I found were phenomenally difficult but rewarding.
So you said that you were litigating the cases that the medical board was putting together. That practically looked like within the hearing process for a lot of it, right? That you were almost acting as our prosecutor within the hearing. And then also when the cases came before the full board, you would then stand up and talk to the board about the reason why that particular licensee should be disciplined. Is that kind of getting that right?
Yeah, that's right. So it's important to note that this is an administrative process, not a civil legal process or a criminal process. So we are in the world of administrative law. We discipline a licensee for violations of the Medical Practices Act. So that's different than, for instance, a trial to prove a crime has been committed. This is an administrative procedure, so it's really a less formal procedure, but still has all of the tough legal questions and still has an evidentiary burden of proof.
So the case that we're going to be talking about today, a big portion of this, we're going to be centered on the hearing and the information that was really exposed and came out in that discussion between patients and talking to that licensee. I am interested in knowing when allegations of sexual misconduct that we're going to be getting into are presented like this, is it normal for a licensee to request a hearing?
Yes, it's very normal with the licensees, especially physicians, to request a hearing. A physician obviously has put a lot of time and money into her or his practice and degree, and these are serious allegations, and physicians will, I would say more often than not, request a hearing, come to the hearing represented by counsel. There is a small bar of attorneys that really focus their practice on defending physicians in the state of Ohio. So we see a lot of those attorneys frequently, and hearings can last anywhere from a day to a week, depending on the severity of the allegations or the number of patients involved.
So what would someone who was just, a member of the public or maybe even a patient who had filed a complaint that ended up in a hearing, what would it look like for them if they came and attended a hearing? What's that process?
Sure. So a lot of people imagine our hearings to be like they would see on Law and Order in a big courtroom with a judge on the bench. They're not like that. They are in a conference room at the State Medical Board of Ohio. There is a hearing examiner who is hired to be an independent fact finder and to make a recommendation to the full board. And the people sit in a conference room around a conference room table. There's at least one assistant attorney general, sometimes two, depending on the complexity of the case. There is the respondent licensee, that person's attorney, and the witness sits at one end of the table, and there's a court reporter to transcribe what everybody says. And parts of it will look like what you see on Law and Order. There's a direct examination of a witness, a cross-examination of a witness. We give openings and closings, and we sometimes close the hearing to the public to protect sensitive testimony or patients who have been victims of sexual misconduct. The state medical board has a statute that requires us to keep confidential the name or identity of complainants, but also of patients. So while these are primarily open to the public, sometimes they will be closed in order to protect that confidentiality.
Yeah, it's helpful for people to understand. We do want to make sure it's such an important thing to come forward to the board, but also can be really intimidating. So there are some precautions in place there just to make sure we're protecting that patient. We'll discuss more after a brief break.
Did you know the medical board participated in more than 40 outreach activities in the last fiscal year? There's so much to know about the State Medical Board of Ohio. If you'd like to learn about how the board regulates medical professionals across the state, you can request a speaker from the board to present to your school or organization, or be an exhibitor at your conference. Contact us today at communications@med.ohio.gov.
Welcome back. We're going to transition a little bit to talk, more about this case that we came here to discuss today. In this particular case, we're going to be calling this Dr. X, by the way. How many patients were involved in this case?
In the case of Dr. X, this was a 3-patient sexual misconduct case.
Okay, so 3 patients. Does that mean that it takes more than one person to complain about a doctor in order for the medical board to take an action?
No, not at all. And in fact, in this particular case, there was somebody that came forward, and after that person came forward, another person saw the allegations that the medical board had put into a notice of opportunity for hearing for Dr. X, and then that person came forward and said, oh my gosh, something similar happened to me. So it's not unusual in cases like this, in a sexual misconduct case, for one person to come forward and then other people to come forward afterwards.
Okay, I understand. So it really helps to kind of strengthen the case, but it's not necessarily a requirement that there's more than one patient. I'm glad that we can clarify that. So can you, as we get into this case, can you summarize what was discussed during this hearing? This was a hearing to really hear what happened with this particular physician that was licensed in Ohio, and to understand how he kind of took advantage really of 3 different patients that were in his office at different times. Let's talk about that. What happened?
Absolutely. So to be clear kind of at the outset of the conversation about the terminology that the medical board uses in these types of cases, the medical board's cases are not criminal cases, as I already mentioned. As in this case, the board usually does not allege that a crime occurred. Rather, the Medical Practices Act prohibits sexual misconduct between a physician and a patient. And sexual misconduct can range from making sexualized and demeaning comments to a patient to unwanted sexual touching. Sexual misconduct can also include draping issues where a physician does not appropriately cover a patient during an intimate examination of the breasts or genitals. These cases, including the case with Dr. X, can be really complicated because often a patient trusts a physician to touch her or him in a medically legitimate and necessary way. And a patient makes her or himself very vulnerable by disrobing, taking off one's clothing. And it can be a very subtle shift when the touching goes from a medically legitimate purpose to a sexual purpose. And we saw that in this case, especially in one of the patients who was an intensely private but very trusting person. She was uniquely vulnerable, and you often see that in sexual misconduct cases where physicians kind of find the vulnerabilities of each patient. She trusted this physician with a particular medical issue that made her vulnerable to him kind of chipping away at the professional boundaries between him and her. He would invite her to lunch. He would email her from his personal email. At one point, he invited her to participate in a task that was not a part of his medical practice, but was kind of in the guise of her helping him with his medical practice. And eventually, he kind of whittled away at that appropriate professional boundary to the point where he was making sexualized comments to her. He was, in the guise of being inadvertent, but revealing her breasts, her body parts during examinations. And that came out in extremely powerful testimony from her.
Interesting. So all of those ways of kind of probably what we consider like buddy kind of behavior that happened before any of the actual physical like contact was made with this patient, right?
That's right. So we see that in a number of sexual misconduct cases where the physician is just a little bit too personal with the patient, starts acting like she or he is your friend or the patient's friend, talking about family, dating, things that you would talk about with your friend. And then all of a sudden, the conversation shifts to perhaps the patient's sexual preferences, the patient's sex life, the patient's sex with family members. So it is this kind of chipping away that can happen over a period of time. So she had every right to believe that Dr. X was trusted by that physician. So he was a trustworthy physician. The inappropriate behavior escalated as time went on. Dr. X, at some point, offered to get naked in front of her in an office visit in the guise of showing her something on his own body that might be occurring on her body.
Can we stop right there? That is not a normal thing to do in a physician office. Is that right, Mindy?
That is absolutely right. A physician should never offer to take off clothes. And it's hard to even fathom that happening. But again, when it's in the guise of a legitimate medical examination and you've built up this relationship with the physician, the patient knew it was wrong, but gave him the benefit of the doubt. And we see that all the time in sexual misconduct cases with physicians. And that's why the behavior can be very complicated, very egregious, a huge violation of trust because you give this person the benefit of the doubt. This physician also did take off his shirt in a medical appointment with patient one because he was asking her to look at a rash on his back. Again, that is never appropriate. That physician is the physician, and that person is responsible for setting the appropriate professional boundaries. And that physician should never be asking a patient for help with anything, let alone a rash on his body. Finally, that physician offered to pick out this patient's swimwear when she was going on vacation.
That's cringeworthy.
Entirely cringeworthy, but also a pattern of grooming, right? Again, chipping away at that boundary, kind of seeing what he could get away with the patient. And this patient was awesome. And she was like, no, you cannot get away with that. Enough is enough.
So I have to ask, why do you think she kept rescheduling the appointments with this physician when she was growing uncomfortable and there were advances in strange behavior?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a very common thing that we see with sexual misconduct victims because there's this kind of push-pull in the relationship. And this physician was actually giving her some relief from the medical conditions for which she sought help. And again, he had built up this relationship where he had chipped away at those professional boundaries and And she had grown a level of respect for him because he was helping her, and he had normalized the behavior. And I think that's a really important takeaway from this case, is the normalization over time. It's so easy to sit and have this discussion, this important discussion, where we're like, oh my gosh, obviously, look what was happening. But if you are the patient in the relationship and it's over a span of years, it isn't that obvious. And in fact, again, you keep giving the physician the benefit of the doubt. After the doctor had kind of chipped away at that professional boundary, it escalated to the point where he was touching her inappropriately. And she testified that on one occasion, he came up behind her and put his arms under her gown and touched her breasts inappropriately, again in the guise of a medical examination. But she knew, because of her medical issues, that it was not for a legitimate medical purpose. Another time, when she was in a gown, he tapped her on her labia. Just tap, and then left it at that. And again, there was no legitimate medical purpose for her to be touching her genitals at all, let alone just a tap. And that type of behavior signifies kind of a grooming, right? Tap just to see what her reaction was going to be. And so she noticed that his conduct was escalating inappropriately. And finally, she was like, enough. We're not going to do this anymore. She stopped seeing him. And the behavior came to the attention of the medical board.
So I'm glad that she was able to realize the behavior was escalating and get herself, into a safe place. Can you tell me more about some of the other patients that were involved in this case?
So patient 2 came along chronologically later than patient 1. And patient 2 was seeing Dr. X because she had some medical issues that were making it difficult for her to continue in a profession that she felt very passionately about and that she did not want to give up. And that made her kind of uniquely vulnerable, in that she testified that she would do anything to maintain this chosen profession, including go to various medical appointments in order to find out what was keeping her from that profession. And Dr. X, in this case, asked her to come in for an evaluation, which she did, and that all went very normally. He was very professional. She said that he was very likable, very easy to talk to. Again, kind of chipping away at that appropriate professional boundary, but very subtly. And all of the patients in this case described him as being very easy to talk to, someone that's almost kind of your friend. He did an evaluation of her. He asked her to come back. He scheduled her for the last appointment of the day. And he told her that he was going to give her an extra long appointment. And she testified she came in that day and everything was normal. There were staff present. She was roomed by an assistant. She took her clothes off, left her gown on, or put a gown on. And I think for any woman that's listening to this podcast, you can appreciate when you take your clothes off for instance, an OBGYN examination. At least I will fold my clothes and I will tuck my bra and underwear underneath my shirt so that the doctor doesn't come in and see her. She described that. And her testimony was so vulnerable and candid in that hearing. And all of these patients were phenomenally strong and brave to make themselves vulnerable again in front of a man who had taken advantage of their vulnerability the first time. And she came in and testified that he, in this extra long appointment, was doing trigger point injections and something called osteopathic manipulation. And it again started out as a normal medical treatment. And at some point, his hand started touching her vagina and her vulva. And she said that she froze, that she almost had this kind of outer body experience where she was looking down on the situation. And she said something so powerful, like, I understood fight and flight, but I never understood freezing. And she said, I describe myself as this powerful woman in a position of authority, and I just froze. And for the people listening to the podcast, this is an incredibly common occurrence for people that have been victims of sexual misconduct, where they freeze. And I'll tell you, in this testimony, I still feel the way the room felt that day, because she was incredibly graphic and appropriately emotional. And at the end of her testimony, you could just hear a pin drop.
I can't imagine being in the room to hear someone really just talk about that, their experience in such a visceral kind of way.
And I think it's also important to talk about how it affected these people after the appointment. This particular patient described after the appointment feeling vulnerable all the time. And unfortunately, sometimes there is some time between the time that the complaint is made and the time that the medical board goes to hearing. And there are a lot of reasons for that, legitimate reasons for that, including a thorough investigation and due process that's required by the law. But at this point in time, she had had some time in between being victimized and testifying, and she still felt that vulnerability. I mean, she described not wanting to wear certain clothes in this physician's presence because she felt vulnerable around him. So it really affects people, not even just in the appointment, but for years afterwards.
Yeah, it was bigger than just that moment. It's impacting her.
Yes, thank you.
Definitely. There was one more patient, I believe, mentioned in this case. Do you have any information about her testimony?
Yeah, so the last patient in this case, again, was the last complaint in chronology or in time. She was a younger patient who came to Dr. X, and again, a similar experience where he was emailing her from his personal email to schedule appointments. He was scheduling her for the last appointment of the day to give her, quote unquote, extra time. This patient, because she was younger, was always accompanied by someone, either her sister or her mother. In one of the visits, Dr. X said to her, kind of in her ear, "I told you to come alone." And that to her was a major red flag. And she said that he was, again, touching her in the guise of a legitimate medical examination, but was touching her breasts and touched her vulva on the outside. And she stopped going to him after that visit, and he continued to email her to try and get her to come back to the practice. And at one point, she called him out on his conduct, and he defended it as legitimate medical touching. But she really stood her ground, and she said, "No, you victimized me."
And just to be clear, the patient was young, but was not a minor, correct?
Yeah, thank you. No, the patient was not a minor. This particular physician was victimizing, of the patients that we know about, patients that were in their 20s to 30s. Okay. And he did kind of have a type, people, people kind of looked the same. The patients kind of looked the same, but definitely were in kind of the same age bracket, young adults, and had unique vulnerabilities. And this physician was not somebody that you would talk to or look at and be like, I don't trust you. I mean, this physician was very personable, very almost likable, if you didn't know the horrific things that he was doing to people. So it did make him a unique kind of dangerous in that, people just didn't see him coming.
And I think I recall from the hearing record that after a complaint was made and he was starting to be investigated, didn't he reach out to that patient and was basically trying to say, "You need to help me because my marriage could be at risk here if this continues forward. I thought we understood each other. This is just a misunderstanding, and come back in and let me talk to you about this." Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, Jerica, you're absolutely right. After this all came to light and he realized he was being investigated, he did reach out to one of the patients, and it was a patient who he had kind of curated this friendship with before victimizing her. And he did say, my marriage is going to fall apart. I'm going to lose my medical practice. Please don't do this to my staff. And she had the wherewithal and the strength to record the conversation when he called her, and he did call her. She didn't reach out to him. And she also really called him out on his conduct, which even as I sit here today kind of gives me chills, because I recognize how difficult that must have been for her for somebody that she at one time respected on the phone to say, no, you victimized me. You did this to yourself. And she did not allow him to shift that guilt onto her.
Absolutely. That does seem like a total disregard for accountability. That, please help me. I thought we were friends, and this can just be resolved personally. That's a lot of audacity, if you ask me.
Absolutely.
We'll discuss more after a brief break.
Every month, the State Medical Board of Ohio meets to discipline providers and vote on policy matters. If you can't attend a meeting or watch it online, there is another way to stay informed. In the weeks following the meeting, the board publishes a monthly formal action list that includes the names of the discipline providers, a summary of the disciplinary actions initiated, and the sanctions imposed by the board during the meeting. To view this list and explore more resources, visit med.ohio.gov.
We've been discussing a sexual misconduct case that came before the board dealing with the accounts of 3 patients. The details of this case have been difficult to hear, and part of that is because they were normal women going to what should have been a normal exam, but ending up in a situation where they were no longer safe. The behavior we described today was unacceptable, and I want to make it absolutely clear that the board heard the testimony of these patients along with the presented evidence and voted to permanently revoke Dr. X's license, which means he will never practice in Ohio again. This is the most severe discipline the board can issue, and it is not a decision that's taken lightly. With all of that in mind, I know it's incredibly important for any patients listening to this podcast to hear stories like this and know how to respond. But if I'm honest, it also worries me that someone listening may become afraid of providers or try to avoid having necessary medical procedures. So I just want to be clear. A case like this is devastating and demands board discipline. But at the end of the day, our data shows sexual misconduct complaints are generally a very small percentage of our overall complaints. So they're rare, and we have put the necessary policies and protocols in place to address them when they occur. Mindy, what can we take away from a case like this?
I think that there are a number of very important takeaways for this case. First of all, a physician is required by the Medical Practices Act to establish appropriate professional boundaries with a patient. And boundaries are established by words. They're also established by draping and chaperones. A chaperone is a requirement when a physician performs any kind of intimate examination, which includes breasts, genitals, and even your anus. Please, if a physician does not offer you a chaperone, request that one be present during an intimate examination. Jerica, I think it's also really important to note in the case of Dr. X that he was not an OBGYN. And the appointments that these women were coming to were not for intimate examinations of their genitals or breast. He had carved out within his specialty this subspecialty where he was giving himself access to very vulnerable patients. And in some cases, he would have the patient come in and she would be appropriately gowned, she would have on her underwear, and he would physically remove her underwear.
Oh my gosh.
He would say, oh, these are just in the way, let's take these off. A physician should never remove clothing for a patient. And again, to people listening, that's a major red flag. If your physician is pulling down your pants, undoing your bra, that should never happen.
Thank you for making that clear. Never. That should never happen.
That should never happen. Also, this physician practiced by himself. And that doesn't mean that every physician that practices by her or himself is going to take advantage of that situation. But in this particular case, this physician practiced by himself without oversight of other physicians. His entire staff was female, and he was scheduling these appointments at the end of the day when no other staff was going to be present. So again, Be aware of your surroundings, just like you would be walking down the street. Be aware of who's present. Make sure there's a chaperone present. And if a physician starts to talk to you about something intensely personal, and I'm not saying, hey, how about the Buckeyes? Or how's the family doing? But, intensely personal about your sex life, and you believe that it's for other than a legitimate medical purpose, trust your instincts.
So I have to ask again, these are some heavy topics, disturbing details, and these are kind of the cases that you specialize in. Mindy, why in the world do you work in this field?
Yeah, I get asked that question all the time. And I have to say, I have such pride in doing this work. I find this work amazingly rewarding. And I do it because every time a patient testifies and stands up and use her or his voice against a physician that has victimized her or him, I feel empowered by it. I mean, I get chills sitting in this studio thinking about some of the victims that have been brave enough to be vulnerable in front of somebody that has victimized them. And it's the most selfless act I've ever seen, because I wish I could say that, we make this process painless and easy, but just innately, it is not an easy process. And we at the medical board do everything that we can to support the victims. We have a victim advocate. We have highly trained assistant attorneys general who represent the board. We have compassionate board members. But it's not an easy process all the time. And so every time I see a victim take the stand and look at the licensee who has taken advantage of their vulnerabilities and say, what you did to me was wrong, I feel empowered by that. And I have watched these victims be empowered in themselves. And every time I prepped a victim, one of the things I would say to them is, I hope that this process gives you back the power that was stolen from you. Because that's what happened. Something was stolen from them. And I had one case where one of the patients started out her testimony and she couldn't even look in the direction of the licensee that had touched her vagina. And by the end of the testimony, she looked over at him and she stood up and she went, what you did to me was wrong. And I was like, yes, you go, girl. And that's why I love my job.
I don't think I have anything else to say to that. This was incredible to hear from you. Again, these are hard details to hear, but also such an important topic and something that we've spent a lot of time and resources making sure that we are prepared to handle these cases and that you are safe when you come to us with that complaint. Mindy, thank you so much. If you're listening to this episode and have experienced something mentioned today during an interaction with the medical provider, we urge you to file a complaint with the appropriate regulatory board, whether that's us, or the Board of Nursing, or the Board of Pharmacy, or the Dental Board, or whoever is responsible for that individual provider. You should not have to navigate an experience like this alone, and it doesn't matter if the incident happened recently or in the past. The medical board, if it's one of our complaints, can investigate based on the account of what happened. I know today's topic was heavy, but I hope it can be used as an informative tool and as education. The board is here to protect the public, and we take our charge very seriously. Please be aware of your surroundings and feel empowered to speak up if something happens that you're uncomfortable with. Thank you for listening to this episode of MedWord Pulse from the State Medical Board. A special thanks to our guest, Mindy Snyder, Deputy Director of Enforcement. Subscribe today to hear our episodes right away. For more information about the Medical Board, email med.ohio.gov. You can also email questions or comments at communications@med.ohio.gov. And remember, the more you listen, the more you'll learn, the more you'll share.